Welcome to the Otherweb. Our guest today is Donald Robertson. Donald is a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist and author of several books, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor and, more recently, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor. He is one of the founders of the Modern Stoicism nonprofit organization and the founder and president of the Plato's Academy Center in Athens, Greece. He was born in Scotland and now lives in Montreal, Canada. Donald, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise, I've been looking forward to this for a pretty long time. So let's start with a broad question. Is there a connection between philosophy and psychology?
Yeah, there's a big connection between philosophy and psychology. There are several types of connection. I guess the simplest answer is that historically, these two things weren't really separate subjects. They only fully became separated at the beginning, around about the beginning of the 20th century. And throughout history, philosophy and psychology were kind of in different aspects, really, of the same discipline. Philosophers did psychology, and you can do psychology on the process of philosophy. You can philosophize about psychological concepts, so they're closely related. My specialism is in psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and in particular, some of the ancient philosophers inspired that approach. There's a pretty strong connection there.
So it looks like in the past, people just followed a philosophy and now they go to a psychologist and maybe what they receive is somewhat connected to something that came out of a philosophical discipline.
That's not a bad way of thinking about it, to be honest. In a sense, people would go to philosophers a bit like they would go to therapists today. People who are depressed or anxious, they'd often seek advice from philosophers or from their friends who had studied philosophy. Philosophers used to write what were known as letters of consolation. We have numerous examples of these from Plutarch and Seneca in particular, where they write letters to their friends, helping them to cope with bereavement or to prepare them to cope with their own death or deal with other setbacks in life. And they give them philosophical and psychological advice to manage their emotions.
So let's talk about some specific examples. I know in the blogosphere, a lot of people at least claim to be following some form of Stoicism. I think the common term is Broicism, referring to those. But I also see in the tech sector, there's quite a few people that follow long-termism or some version of it, where they're optimizing for humanity being multiplanetary in 500 years. And what happens today is kind of minor in comparison. So how do you see these play out? Are these positive? Are they negative? What effects are you observing?
I mean, I think it's good that anyone's interested in Stoicism. I think eventually they'll get to read Marcus Aurelius or something like that, and they'll see what it's really like. There definitely is a lot of misinformation about Stoicism. I hope that's going to improve over time. The internet is awash with fake quotes from philosophers, which find a way even into books now. They're just made up. AI, I think, is now making that worse. ChatGPT has this weird habit of making up quotes. Someone started having a debate with me about something they said was in one of my books, and I had to kind of do a double take. And I thought, I never said that. Where did you get this from? And the ChatGPT had made up a quotation that doesn't exist anywhere on the internet or anywhere, and attributed it to me. But more importantly, it does that with Marcus Aurelius and other ancient philosophers. So people have to kind of get through all of this misinformation to get to what Stoicism actually was about. And there are also influencers that want to jump on the bandwagon, I guess. Some of these guys, I'm 99.9% sure have never actually read any books on Stoicism or, at bare minimum, if you're going to talk about books, you probably have to have read them, or at least bits of them, But there are people who have just kind of shamelessly not read any of it, but kind of write articles about it and do podcasts about it and stuff like that. And so they say stuff that's just bizarre, that's like the opposite of what the Stoics would have said. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a video by Andrew Tate talking about how apparently he's a fan of Marcus Aurelius. But then he goes on to say stuff that's almost the complete opposite of what Marcus Aurelius would typically say. So you have to get past the influencers and the AI and, all the misinformation on Google. If you go back to the original source, you'll find out what Stoicism was really about. maybe we could do a little bit of a deep dive into what the differences are between those types of advice, because I think it's quite important, if you're okay with a short digression.
Yeah, absolutely. That was my next question anyway. Which elements of Stoicism are actually useful to today's people? What should people know if they try to get the original and not Andrew Tate's version?
I'll try and give you the best short account of this that I can. So when I taught, I used to teach psychotherapists and counselors and life coaches and stuff. So people want techniques like self-help techniques and therapy techniques. And I always thought it was important to explain to people that the benefits you get from the techniques kind of depend on your understanding of how the mind works and how emotions work. So you can't just jump in and grab the technique without any understanding of, what you're doing, right? You need a little bit of theory in order to know how to use techniques effectively. So the main thing that Stoicism contributes to the history of psychology is a very simple theoretical concept. They have a theory of emotion, or a model of emotion, we should say, that says that our cognitions, our beliefs, and our patterns of thinking shape our emotions more than we normally assume, to a greater extent than we normally realize. And that became the inspiration for what we call cognitive psychotherapy. Now, if you realize that your anger, fear, sadness are shaped by your underlying beliefs and attitudes more than you normally realize, more than most people think, then that opens up a whole repertoire of cognitive therapy techniques that you can use. Now, when people talk about Stoicism, the word in modern English has come to denote a coping style, an emotional coping style that people sometimes equate with having a stiff upper lip. And there's lots of research on this. I would define it technically as an emotional coping style in which people try to suppress or conceal unpleasant or embarrassing emotions, right? It's the crudest way of coping with emotions. It's the simplest way of coping. It's one of the most popular ways of coping with emotions. It's a form of avoidance in a way, because it's about trying to get rid of your anger, or avoid thinking about it, or conceal it from other people. And it doesn't work very well. Like, it's toxic, for want of a better word. Like, it works temporarily, but usually makes you more messed up psychologically in the long term. Now, also, I'll do a digression within a digression. Like, it's important because people tend to think that having a stiff upper lip makes you tough. It's associated with toughness and with certain conceptions of masculinity. But the irony about this is it makes you the opposite of tough in the long term. If you try to cope with your emotions in this way, you'll become more emotionally vulnerable and fragile as a result, right? It doesn't make you tough, but it makes you fragile if you do this, for a bunch of reasons which we could dissect if we want. Ancient Stoicism has a much more nuanced view of emotion. So it says, for example, some aspects of emotion are involuntary, some aspects are more under voluntary control. Emotions are shaped by certain types of cognition. If you know that your cognitions or beliefs shape your emotions, then you can start identifying what those beliefs are and questioning whether they are true or false, rational or irrational, right? And it has social implications, because if our emotions are shaped by our beliefs, what shapes our beliefs? Well, sadly, what shapes our beliefs is the internet, politicians, influencers. Oh my God, this is sounding awful, isn't it? It sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. And that shapes our emotions. Yeah, that shapes our emotions, right? So the problem would be critical thinking, the philosophical methods, Socratic questioning are tools that maybe can help us to clean up this mess of unfounded opinions and irrational beliefs that fuel unhealthy emotions, toxic emotions. And the Stoics start off by having this more nuanced view of emotion that distinguishes between different aspects of it. So their idea is that we would cope by identifying and modifying the cognitions in a rational way. So I'll give you an example. Andrew Tate says that if you get really angry, in this video about Marcus Aurelius, he says if you get really angry because your girlfriend dumps you or something like that, that's natural. And, you should accept those feelings. And although he also at times talks about suppressing them, and you should go to the gym and try and kind of channel that anger into some kind of constructive activity. Now, that sounds like it makes sense, but it doesn't work that well as a way of coping with emotion, because it ignores the fact that your beliefs shape your emotions, right? And so going to the gym is going to do nada, nothing, probably, right? Generally speaking, it's not going to do anything to change the underlying beliefs and attitudes that made you get so upset in the first place when your girlfriend broke up with you, right? And so cognitive therapy would say, well, can you imagine someone else responding differently? Could someone else have thought, maybe this is for the best? Could someone else have thought there's plenty more fish in the sea? Can someone else have thought this is bad, but it's not the end of the world? Are there a range of different ways that someone could interpret the emotional significance of their girlfriend breaking up with them, other than, oh my God, this is a catastrophe, I'm so angry about it, right? But going to the gym doesn't do anything to change any of that. Like at most, it's a kind of Band-Aid approach. It makes you feel a little bit better temporarily, but you still got the same underlying attitudes that made you vulnerable to getting upset in the first place. So cognitive therapy digs deeper into our beliefs, and that's what Stoicism advises that we do as well. I'd put it another way. There's research on what we call lowercase Stoicism. We always write it with a lowercase when we're talking about the emotional coping style that shows that it's unhealthy for you. As I mentioned earlier, there's research on cognitive therapy that shows that it's good for you. So we wouldn't want to confuse these two things. Because one of them is known to be bad for you. One of them is known to be good for you. The internet is awash with people that can't tell the difference between them and mix them up.
So let's talk about the thing that you're saying is bad for you. And obviously, I am prone to it. I think most men from the old world tend to be prone to it because this is how our parents, or at least our fathers, raised us. And so I keep having this question with something like negative emotions. If you let them out, do you get more of them? Or did you just release the urge and therefore you get less? Is it more like I eat something sweet and therefore I'm going to binge on sweet stuff? Or is it I let it out, I'm good, and now I can just move on with my life in the short term?
Well, we know quite a lot about this, right? There's a lot of research on it, right? But sometimes this is called venting or catharsis. Like it's based on what sometimes is called the hydraulic model of emotion. It's the idea that emotions build up like a kind of pressure, or like pus and assist. And if you lance it or you kind of purge it out of your system, you kind of get all the emotion out, right? And that was how Freud originally thought that emotion worked, although he kind of evolved his views over time. So it was a very popular view for a long time, but not anymore. Psychologists now generally think that this is a very simplistic model. It's not really how emotions work. If you combine it with doing other things, it could potentially help you, but on its own, it will generally just make the emotion stronger and make it more likely to. So if you cry a lot, I mean, it's easier if you take a step back and look at other people that you know, right? Like people who cry and vent their emotions a lot, it might sometimes make them feel better temporarily, but you can also see that in many cases, it just becomes a habit, right? And people start to indulge in it more and more. And the same with anger. I mean, if venting your anger just got it out of your system, then Mike Tyson, would be like Buddha. He'd be Zen-like, and people that vent their anger and lose their temper would be very tranquil in general, and that's obviously not true, right? We don't see that happening consistently around us. Common sense should tell us that it doesn't really work like that.
Though I have to say, sorry for interrupting, but I had the period in my life where I trained in boxing for 3 times a week. And I've noticed that for the rest of the time, I was actually much calmer, because I guess it's not that I was venting emotion that happened in the moment. It's just that I added this thing to my life for other reasons. But it ended up consuming all the negative emotions I had. So I had no reason to express them anywhere else.
Yeah. But then when you stop boxing, the things that were making you angry to begin with are probably going to remain the same.
Correct.
Right? So venting is just a little bit like taking tranquilizer pills or something, or drinking beer or smoking dope or something. It kind of affects your emotions temporarily, but it doesn't, at least not in a direct way, like change the underlying causes of them. I think what it might be worth saying is, like we touched on suppressing emotion, like why. So we've talked about venting emotion. I mentioned earlier suppressing emotion. Why? I think I can explain quite briefly some of the reasons why suppressing emotion doesn't work very well.
Sure.
Like one is that when people try to suppress their anxiety, to block it, or use drugs to conceal it or distract themselves from it, it's based on an assumption that anxiety is kind of threatening. It's a bad thing. Like, so for instance, people with severe social anxiety will think if anyone sees my hands shaking, that would be humiliating and terribly embarrassing. So like exhibiting anxiety is often seen as a horrific, a terrible thing, right? Now, the problem is that your brain is wired that if you view something as threatening or dangerous, you'll naturally tend to allocate more attention to it for longer periods of time. So, if you were back in the past when we were little furry animals, if a predator appeared on the horizon, we'd like automatically give all of our attention to that in order to protect ourselves. It's a survival mechanism. But if you think your own anxiety is threatening, you'll tend to focus more attention on it for longer. It'd be like putting it under a magnifying glass, right? So seeing anxiety or anger or sadness is something you have to get rid of. Threatening causes us to allocate more attention than normal to them, and that tends to amplify their effect on us. We also know from research that when we ask people to suppress thoughts or emotions, they often recur more frequently in the future. There's something called the paradox of thought suppression, or the rebound effect in psychology. The other problem with it is that if you're trying to kind of suppress anxiety, it increases cognitive load, so you can't perform other tasks as well. So if you're trying to do public speaking, say, and also try to kind of like stop your hand shaking and suppress your anxiety, it's like you try to walk and chew gum. You're doing two things at once, and that makes it overload your brain. It gets kind of confusing potentially, and so you make more mistakes. You become more self-conscious. Those are some of the reasons. There are others why trying to suppress or conceal emotion can backfire and makes us more fragile, really, in the long term, as opposed to accepting those feelings, viewing them as harmless and natural, and examining the underlying beliefs that caused them in the first place.
So let's cover a few more things that don't work, and then we'll dive into the thing that is supposed to work. I've actually seen some psychological exercises that I think come from neurolinguistic programming in the 70s, of trying to just reprogram your brain to switch from one emotion to another based on anchoring it to something, right? Every time I imagine this thing, it makes me happy. So if I feel sadness and I want to feel happy, all I have to do is imagine the thing that is anchored to happiness. Is that a viable tactic? And if not, why?
Well, I'm going to upset people by saying this, but neurolinguistic programming itself is kind of a pseudoscience, is viewed as pretty bogus by like most modern psychologists. It was kind of a fad. It was really big in the 80s and to some extent in the 90s, and then it kind of petered out a little bit. Almost everything that's done in NLP is kind of just copied from other forms of psychotherapy or other branches of psychology. So the stuff about anchoring is I think, inspired by basically behavioral conditioning, like techniques that are used in behavior therapy. We talk about setting up cues or triggers. They changed the terminology and call it setting up anchors, basically. So to some extent, you can create associations or create triggers. Like that can be an effective way of managing emotion. The problem sometimes is where it doesn't do. So again, doing that doesn't address the beliefs that you have surrounding your emotions. So you're potentially still just left with the same beliefs, attitudes, the same way of thinking about the emotions themselves. Like, all this baggage that you've got that makes your emotions problematic isn't really affected directly anyway by setting up triggers. But nevertheless, it can be useful. You can definitely evoke certain emotions by creating a mental association. I'll give you an example that we commonly use in therapy. You could train yourself to systematically relax all the muscles in your body. It can take weeks and weeks to do that, learn how to do that properly, right? But you could lower your heart rate significantly, have profound physiological effect. And you could associate that with a cue word or like an anchor. Like you could say the word peace and press the base of your thumbnail or something that you don't normally do, right? As a signal that once you're in that state. And then at other times, you might press the base of your thumbnail and say the trigger word peace, and then just remember what it felt like when you were last in that state. So you wouldn't have to spend 20 minutes relaxing all the muscles in your body. You might just be able to kind of re-evoke that feeling of relaxation more quickly by using a trigger that you set up. That technique's been used quite extensively in psychotherapy, and there's quite a lot of research that shows that it can be effective. But I guess it's got limited effectiveness because, like I say, it doesn't address other aspects of your common problems.
Right. So there is another parable or thought that comes to mind, which is Jonathan Haidt's description of the rider and the elephant, where the elephant decides where to go, and the rider then spends all his mental capacity coming up with a rational post hoc explanation as to why he wanted to go in that direction. So is there a risk that when we're analyzing our emotions like this and we're thinking, how do I analyze what got me to behave in a certain way? How do I modify it? All we're doing is coming up with explanations for our natural tendencies anyway.
That's a tricky question. I suppose the easiest way to answer it is that we have research that shows that cognitive therapy works. And so I think someone asked me this question before, and what they were driving at was like, look, if this is true, then cognitive therapy shouldn't work. But cognitive therapy does work, right? There are hundreds of studies that show that it does. So that would suggest, and really the question is a bit more complex than this implies, but that would suggest that we are able to identify the cognitions that shape our behavior accurately enough that it's worth doing, and it can change our behavior and change our emotions. So, I mean, we know that cognitive therapy works, is the short answer.
So we are able to use rational thought to modify emotions, at least in the long term, as opposed to just providing post hoc explanations for them.
Yeah, maybe there's other ways of interpreting what's going on, but if the practical point is there any value in doing this? Are we just kidding ourselves? Well, yeah, there is. We know, like, cognitive therapists do this every day with their clients, and there are hundreds and hundreds of research studies that demonstrate that the client's beliefs are changing, and that's having an effect on their emotions and their behavior.
So let's dive then into the thing that we are supposed to do to essentially receive a better outcome. Is this something that we should do in the short term? I feel anger right now, therefore right now I should pause and ask myself these questions. Or is this modifying our beliefs over a period of a few months so that next time anger will not arise so suddenly?
Well, there's different ways of approaching it. But generally speaking, if somebody's very angry, I suggest that it's better to wait until the anger has naturally abated and then start addressing the underlying beliefs. The reason being that when you're in the grip of a strong emotion, it's much harder to think rationally. Your thinking is one of the, let me put it this way, one of the main things that emotions do is that they bias your thinking. And so it's difficult to think clearly and rationally when your brain is not in a rational state and your thinking is biased and highly selective, for example. So it's easier if you wait until your anger has abated and then you begin to examine and question like the underlying thoughts that are causing it.
Right. And in the long term, is there something that we should work on to try and modify the belief system so that next time maybe we don't judge this thing as so threatening that it angers us?
Actually, I would say the most important thing is, let me digress a little bit. I'll take a step back and explain something about cognitive therapy. Aaron T. Beck, who is the main pioneer of cognitive behavioral therapy, along with Albert Ellis, he said that we should say to ourselves, where's the evidence for that in relation to the beliefs that upset us? So, for example, if someone is anxious, the stereotypical beliefs that they have is that something catastrophic is about to happen and that they won't be able to cope with it. Now, that those beliefs might be true or they might be false. They could be exaggerated. They could be selective. So Beck says we should ask ourselves, where's the evidence that something catastrophic is going to happen? Where's the evidence that it's going to be as bad as you think? Where's the evidence that it's going to happen imminently? Where's the evidence that you won't be able to cope with it? And so you begin using Socratic questioning to modify those beliefs. But in order to do that, Beck pointed out, you have to adopt a stance towards your beliefs, which is different from normal. So you have to view them as hypotheses that are up for debate, as it were, right? Now, if you bear with me, it's a little bit tricky to explain this concept to people because it's not very familiar to them. But we often we experience beliefs linked to our emotions in a way that fuses them with external events. So when I'm really angry and I think that something's a catastrophe, I don't really experience myself thinking, oh, like, this looks like it might be a catastrophe for me. I just see the event as catastrophic, right? There's no separation between the event itself and my opinion about it. Like, Beck compares it to putting coloured glasses on. If you have blue lenses in your glasses, the world seems blue. But at first, when you put them on, you might think, oh, these lenses make everything look blue. Like, my beliefs are making everything seem catastrophic. But if you've been wearing the glasses for a long time and you forget that you've got them on, you might just think the world is blue. Like, that house is blue, that person is blue. You might confuse the lens with the external thing that you're observing and assume that what's really a subjective quality is actually an inherently objective quality in the world outside. So no, the clients will say, no, this is a catastrophe. You don't understand. That guy is an idiot. Like, this is a jerk. I am worthless, right? They think they're describing objective reality. And Beck says there's a move that you have to make called cognitive distancing. So we have to use jargon for it because there isn't a word in English for this. And cognitive distancing would be like taking the glasses off and looking at them and going, oh, these lenses are blue. That's what makes the world seem blue. So cognitive distancing would be like taking a sidestep and observing your own thinking and realizing that there's a kind of arbitrariness to it. Like, yes, you view losing your job as catastrophic, but you could also view it as an opportunity, or you could view it as bad, but not catastrophic, right? There's a number of different, you could put red glasses on or green glasses like as well. So realizing that you have that flexibility and being able to view your beliefs as changeable is you could call it a stance. Sometimes we call it metacognitive awareness, technically, right? It's a prerequisite of being able to question your beliefs, right? In order to question your beliefs, you have to realize that they are just beliefs, not confuse them with facts about the external world. So clients in therapy are often at that place when they come in initially, they think that they're worthless and you want to help them to question that. It seems a strange thing to do because they go, no, I just am worthless. It's a fact. Like, they don't even view it as a stance that they're adopting or an assumption that they're making that could be true or false, right? Now, it's interesting because in the age that we live in the internet age, we're bombarded with misinformation and verbal manipulation online. It wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for the fact that we fuse it with reality. Right? If we just treated it all as a bit of a joke or something, or we treated it as a work of fiction, it'd be different. But we buy into it. Like, we start to agree, and it shapes our perception of reality, right? So cognitive distancing, I think over time is going to become even more important to our survival psychologically. We have to learn to differentiate between reality and fiction better. When you worry about something or when you get depressed, it's kind of like you're telling yourself a story, right? But when you become so absorbed in a story, like someone's telling you a horror story around the campfire, and your heart rate starts to increase and the hairs stand up in the back of your neck because you're so immersed in the story, that's fusion, we call it. Like, you're confusing it with reality temporarily. Someone else might listen to exactly the same story, but think it's just a story, right? It's not evocative for them. They don't lose themselves in the story in the same way. So, the thoughts that we have when we're worrying or morbidly ruminating don't necessarily affect us emotionally as long as we maintain cognitive distance and we avoid fusing them with reality. In the same way, all the garbage on the internet doesn't necessarily have to affect us, unless we buy into it and fuse it with reality. We could just, view it in a much more detached way. But that's a knack that we have to learn. It's a cognitive skill that comes before any of this philosophical questioning. So the long-term thing, I think, would be to learn this greater. Many people have compared it to like Buddhist mindfulness in some ways. It's the ability, we call it metacognitive awareness. Metacognition is cognition about cognition, or thinking about thinking. So metacognitive awareness is being aware of our thinking, it's a deeper form of self-consciousness or self-awareness that allows us to observe our own thoughts with a degree of detachment like it's similar to what people practice in Buddhist mindfulness practice, but we approach it from more of a, I guess, a bottom-up perspective in psychology. You don't have to wear beads or burn incense or wear sandals or anything, to do this. You don't even have to sit cross-legged or, sit in meditation to learn these skills. We can kind of identify this quite specific set of skills that are similar to ones we find in meditation, but we also use them more generally in cognitive therapy. And they're very powerful. When, people are able to observe the thoughts that make them angry and view them from a kind of detached and flexible perspective, two things happen, right? Number one, most obviously, it tends to dilute the intensity of your emotions. So if you're just really angry because your girlfriend dumped you, right? But you're able, one guy just thinks, this is awful. Like, she's a horrible person. Like, she's a bitch for doing this. Like, right? And they're fused with these thoughts. Another person might think, I notice right now that I'm telling myself this is awful. And I notice that I'm thinking of her as a bitch, right? But other people might see the situation differently. I myself in the future might look back on it from a different perspective. If you have that kind of flexibility, your anger will tend to be, it might not go away completely, but it's probably going to be diluted. If you want to make yourself more angry, get more fused, like with the belief, right? If you want to make yourself less angry, like take a step back, observe them in a detached way, consider the situation from different perspectives. So that's number one. It will reduce the intensity of the anger, fear, sadness. But more subtly and more importantly, I think, longer term, it makes you better at problem solving. So if you're able to step back from your beliefs and view situations in multiple ways, it's generally much easier for you to think about how to act differently in the future. You're more able to problem solve, as we put it in psychology. Like, what are you going to go and do differently because your girlfriend's dumped you? Like, how are you going to cope over the next few weeks? Like, what's your plan of action? It's easier to do that in a more rational way if you've got this kind of cognitive distance or detachment. So you won't be as stuck. And that's going to help you more in the longer term. And that's the foundation of cognitive therapy. And then after that comes the ability to say, okay, I notice that I'm telling myself this is a catastrophe, but is there any evidence that it's as bad as I make out to be? Is there any evidence that I'm as incapable of coping as I'm telling myself that I am? And that questioning technique should really come after we've achieved a degree of cognitive distancing. Beck originally said, this is the foundation. You have to do this distancing first, and then you can do the Socratic questioning, like the kind of philosophical questioning. However, the next generation of researchers thought he underestimated how powerful this first step was. And so they did research on what happens if you just do the cognitive distancing on its own without questioning the evidence for and against your beliefs. And they found that when they focused on doing that more consistently, people were able to benefit from it in ways that we hadn't expected before. So we call that the third wave in CBT research, or we call it mindfulness and acceptance-based CBT. There are many different versions of it today, but the culture shifted about 20 years ago, roughly, and people became more persuaded on the basis of many, many research studies that this, what we often thought of as a prerequisite, is actually more central to mental health than previously assumed.
So I want to ask you about a specific corner case that I've observed in some people, where their negative emotion in the moment doesn't just color their perception of the moment, it colors their memory of everything that happened before. So if I'm having a bad day, life has been terrible all along. Or if I'm angry at this person because they sent me an email I don't like, this person has been an asshole for the past 2 years, right? And then when the anger passes, then that memory fades. But the problem with that, as I see it, based on what you just said, is that now my emotion is generating evidence for why this emotion has been correct for the past several years. How do you handle that?
Well, that comes back to what we said about strong emotions, such as anger, are well known to bias your thinking in multiple ways. And the Stoics were very aware of this. They said anger is temporary madness, which is a cute way of putting it. But we know, for example, people who are angry typically underestimate risk. They tend to look for evidence of hostility. They're not very good at empathizing or understanding. They tend to oversimplify the motives of other people. So their thinking is skewed or biased in simple ways, measurable ways that cause them to get more angry, right? It's like a self-perpetuating cycle that they get into. And absolutely, if someone upsets me, I tend to kind of put a magnifying glass over the thing that upsets me, and I forget about other factors that might moderate my anger. So, this guy just called me an idiot, right? And if I get tunnel vision for that, it's going to make me angrier than if I think this guy called me an idiot. But man, he's been my best friend for years, and he just helped an old lady across the street, and I know that he's been he's been bereaved recently, and he's been through a lot emotionally, and so if I paint a more complex picture of the situation, it's maybe going to moderate the intensity of my emotions. But we don't do that when we're angry. When we're angry, we just get tunnel vision for the thing that's upsetting us. So we ignore contrary evidence, and we also go looking we get a confirmation bias, and we go looking for things that are going to confirm our anger. But that's why I said it's better to wait until your anger has abated. And in order to do that, the first step would be gain cognitive distancing. And I mean, if I back up a little bit, what I'd normally do with a client who's got anger, first of all, work on their motivation. So I'd get them to really think in vivid ways about the consequences of anger versus overcoming it. So you have to make sure the motivation is strong enough, first of all, and there are ways to enhance that and assess it. But being really determined that you're going to do something about your anger. Next step is to catch it earlier. Right? How can you notice when you're getting angry? Most people don't realize. If you were getting angry, I might notice, right? I might think his voice has changed, like his facial expression has changed. But we don't normally. It's like a slippery slope, so we don't notice until we're halfway down down the slope that we've become angry. Other people sometimes will notice before we do ourselves, right? Because often our voice changes, right? So you can train clients, or we can train ourselves to notice what we call early warning signs of an emotion like anger and catch little cues for it. We can also notice high-risk situations. So I can notice things that typically trigger my anger, and then I can be on the lookout. So I can go, okay, so I'm talking to I'm talking to my mother-in-law. I know that I usually end up getting angry in these conversations. So right out of the gate, I can go, I'm going to look out in this situation for early warning signs of anger, because I know it's a high-risk situation for me lapsing into an episode of anger. And I know that my voice usually changes. And I know that I start to focus on particular issues. So I'll keep a lookout for me doing that, in order to catch it as early as I can. And then often catching it earlier in itself will prevent the emotion from escalating. But it also gives us the option of doing a bunch of things, right? One is just to gain more cognitive distance. So there are techniques that we can use to train ourselves to be able to do that kind of sidestep move and view our own thoughts in a detached way, like that. Getting it early, being prepared for typical high-risk situations, learning to do that kind of sidestep move are things that will help us manage our anger in a situation. And then afterwards, once the anger has abated, we can start examining, what were the thoughts that were making me so upset in that situation? And is that the whole story? Was I missing something that might have mitigated those emotions or reduced their intensity somehow? That's basically what I would typically do with a client.
What if it's something much more mundane or much less acute than anger? Let's say I've had a bad night of sleep. I woke up in a slightly sour mood. And so in the middle of that day, when I evaluate the performance of my marketing contractor over the past 2 years, I might conclude that he kind of sucked all along just because I'm in a bad mood, right? Is there a way to notice that kind of blue lens on history?
I think so. It's not something we deal with as much in clinical practice because it's a sort of more, like you say, it's more mundane. It's a milder form of a problem, but we do a little bit. You've already mentioned in a way that you might notice there are signs. So it might be that you feel differently when you wake up, or it might be that you notice that you're talking or acting differently. So training yourself to get better than normal at noticing those signs is the first step. How do you do that? You can do it to some extent there are a number of ways that there are different techniques you can use. But I mean, one is talking to someone about it. One would be keeping a journal, recording your thoughts, feelings, anything that you notice that might be evidence that you're in that mood, and just being aware that it can bias your thinking. And so asking yourself when you're upset, is this the reality or is this just my irritation speaking? Like, would be one way of gaining distance, right? But I suppose what you're saying is if you're in like that mood all day, then yeah, you probably want to try and catch it early and notice what signs there might be. Like, that keeping a journal might help you do that. If you're having coaching or therapy, speaking to a coach or therapist about it might be a way to help you become more aware of the signs that you're in that state of mind. And I guess thinking of it, I mean, for some people, backing up even further, just thinking of themselves as having different brain states, like certain devices that we have different modes of functioning, right? I guess your mobile phone has a power saving mode or whatever. It's got airplane mode and things like that. It helps a lot of people just to realize you've got anxiety mode, you've got irritation mode, you've got anger mode. And when your brain is in that mode, you're not thinking normally, right? A bunch of things change, like your ability to reason is skewed, right? So realizing I'm in irritation mode right now, right? And when I'm in irritation mode, that definitely has an effect on the way I interact with people and the way I think about stuff. Viewing it in that way, I mean, that sounds almost like too simple, but actually it often helps a lot of people just to conceptualize it in that way. I've got a different head on right now.
So to an engineer, that sounds like calibration. Like, here's what I'm perceiving from reality, but here's my perception of my own perception state. Let's add them up somehow to come up with what reality really is.
Yeah, you have to know that you're in that state to begin with. So looking for the cues is crucial, and understanding that it is a different state that you're in, I think makes a big difference as well. But that's really the most important. There's other things you could do, but there's things you can do to try and counteract bias and stuff. But the most important thing by far is just realizing that you are looking at the world through blue lenses is the most important and usually the first step.
Right. I want to come back full circle because we started from philosophy versus psychology, or them being two sides of the same coin. If I look at a philosophy like Stoicism, it was practiced by everybody from a slave like Epictetus to an emperor like Marcus Aurelius. But you said a couple of answers ago that in therapy, you typically only look at more acute problems.
Yes.
And then you're trying to bring a person back to a normal functioning state. So what is the version of psychology that helps an emperor like Marcus Aurelius who probably doesn't need a therapist?
Well, I think everybody can benefit. Everybody at times in their life has severe anxiety, even if they're not diagnosable. But by the way, mental health diagnosis is really common. Over 50% of people in the US have a history of meeting criteria for psychiatric diagnosis. How weird is that? We used to call it abnormal psychology. And recently people have said, well, that doesn't make sense because actually it's more like the norm now, right? So even pathological emotions are pretty common. And but extreme anger, anxiety, and depression that wouldn't meet diagnostic criteria is kind of something everyone experiences at some point. However, modern cognitive therapy, where these things overlap, I think the best answer to your question is that therapy is, all therapists are aware that they arrived too late on the scene. By definition, when you do any type of therapy, somebody already has a problem. And what would be better would be if they just never got the problem in the first place, right? So if we could do preventative work, prevention, as everyone knows, is better than cure, right? And there is research on prevention in mental health. Usually it's associated with something we call emotional resilience training. That's the terminology that we typically use. So in psychology, resilience is somebody's ability to endure setbacks, misfortunes, or traumas without developing diagnosable mental health problems like PTSD or usually a lot of the researchers on clinical depression, for example. And so by definition, people that you do resilience training with aren't mentally ill yet. Like, you catch them young, right? Before, the idea is we get them before they have these problems. So it's done with school children often, but it's done with other populations as well. And people in the army get resilience training, for example. Groups that we think are going to be exposed to a lot of stress are sometimes given resilience training. So Stoicism is in some ways more like what we now think of as resilience training. Resilience training is heavily influenced by research on CBT for several reasons, but it's also influenced by positive psychology and other traditions, other branches of psychological research. So that's where I think the overlap is. Stoicism likewise wants people to change not just a specific problem that they have with anger or anxiety, but it wants them to change the whole worldview. The goals of Stoicism are deeper and broader in scope than modern psychotherapy usually is. And it's earlier, it's preventative as well. But it employs many of the same kind of techniques. There's probably more emphasis on Stoicism on the more general idea of what is it, what sort of beliefs make us particularly prone. At the deepest and most general level, the Stoics think that it's when we try to control things that aren't under our direct control, and when we place too much value on external events and not enough value on our own character. That's their diagnosis, basically. They think that's the general problem that underlies most emotional issues in specific situations. So at a philosophical level, they want us to dig deep within ourselves and change our perspective, almost like do a U-turn, like turn around our perspective so that we start to view wealth and reputation and things like that as being of secondary importance, less important than the majority of people typically see them as being, and our character and our way of responding or coping with these things as being more intrinsically valuable.
There's also something that what kind of attracted me about Stoicism to begin with is the antidote to hedonic adaptation, because that seems to be something that they are teaching people to inoculate themselves against.
Yeah, that's Bill Irvine mentions that idea. I think it's slightly different from the emphasis that you get in the ancient Stoics, but the first modern best-selling book in Stoicism is called A Guide to the Good Life, and it has this idea about Stoicism being a remedy for hedonic adaptation by imagining loss. Actually, there's a good passage, I don't know if Bill mentions it, but Marcus Aurelius says something, one of the coolest passages in the Meditations. Marcus says that most people imagine the presence of things that are absent. So I don't have a Ferrari, but I might imagine having what it'd be like to have one. And Marcus says that just it doesn't really help you that much, and it creates desire and a kind of pain in many situations. It causes me maybe to envy what other people have got and to get frustrated because I don't have things that I can imagine having and desire. And he says, instead of imagining the presence of things that are absent, you should imagine the absence of things that are present. And that requires more effort. It's less natural, but you should do it the other way around. So I might imagine, I do this a lot. It seems kind of trite in a way or odd, but I really think it's helped me a lot personally in life, that I'll be sitting and I'll imagine, especially in Canada, I'll imagine I didn't have radiators or a microwave oven, or imagine I didn't have a roof over my head and I'm just sitting in a little log cabin with a candle, nothing to read except the Bible. If I was born, 150 years ago or something like that, how my life would be different. So imagine what it'd be like if I didn't have all of these luxuries that we take for granted today. And what that should cultivate is gratitude rather than desire. And Marcus thinks gratitude is a much healthier emotion. Basically, it's a bit of a simplification, but essentially, it takes more effort to experience gratitude. But when we experience, it has less of a downside, and it can evoke a different quality of pleasure and happiness that's more sustainable, perhaps, in the long term for us.
So this leads me to the last question that I didn't plan to ask, but now I just have to ask it because I've given this advice to people many times. Think about the bad things that might happen and you'll be pleasantly surprised when they don't happen. Think about not having the things that you have and you'll have gratitude for them, etc. And a lot of people, especially those who have been alive in the past few decades, immediately come back with, no, you should think about all the great things that are coming your way because it will attract them, right? The law of attraction approach to things, or positive thinking.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Those are exactly opposite to each other. Should we try to combine them in some way, or is one of those good and the other just bad?
I think some people think you can try and combine them. The law of attraction, I'll put it like, let's start off very simply. It's not popular with cognitive therapists, right? Like, and many people have noticed it seems like on the face of it, it seems like it's completely at odds with what Stoicism was teaching. Even the ancient Stoics mention the fact that some people, Epictetus says you should imagine losing your child. And he says some people were freaked out by that, and they say talking about death like that, these are words of ill omen, he says. So there's a common superstition in the ancient world that if you think about death or talk about it, it might make it happen, right? It's similar to a little bit like the law of attraction. You attract bad things by doing that, and he disputes that's right. So we even kind of get these little glimpses of the ancient stories directly tackling similar kind of view. Now, I'll qualify this by saying maybe there's other ways of interpreting the law of attraction. You know, maybe rather than metaphysically or in a kind of superstitious way, you might say if you picture your goals, it changes your behavior in a way that makes you more likely to achieve them. Actually, the research in psychology suggests that is problematic. People who picture long-term goals often don't behave in ways that make them more likely to bring them about. They often do just feel envious or depressed or whatever because they're not achieving them. What research shows is that it's more effective for people to picture the steps that would be required in order to achieve the goals.
What about something that sports psychologists tend to do a lot, which is tell the athlete to visualize their victory?
Yeah.
Exactly how the fight will go, how they're going to knock the other guy out, and therefore you will have more confidence when you fight.
My understanding is that the research, this is a branch of research that we call modeling. And again, it varies, but generally speaking, like picturing successful outcomes can be helpful. There's pros and cons to doing it. It can make us complacent. It can make us frustrated. But it's more helpful usually to picture coping with setbacks. Because if you don't do that, then you're not prepared when you encounter inevitable setbacks. And the research generally shows that that's a healthier strategy. So there's a lot of self-help advice out there that focuses on what we call mastery modeling and visualizing success and stuff. I think that's bad advice, or at least it's overly simplistic advice. It needs to be combined with other stuff. It's hit and miss, like would be the most generous way of putting it. It's not advice that we'd normally give people in CBT. Positive thinking, clients in therapy, you can learn a lot just by, every client comes into therapy, you assess, and if you're a therapist in detail, and you ask, you'll hear them over and over again, they'll tell you they're doing certain things. So we learn that there are coping strategies that people typically use by default that often just make them worse. And positive thinking would be up there, like in the top 3 most popular coping strategies of people who are failing to cope. Basically, you go, okay, you're trying really hard to think positively, but you're just getting more depressed. That's like all my clients say that, right? So you could argue maybe they're doing it wrong, right? But certainly a lot of people engage in these success, mastery, positive thinking, coping techniques because they get it from self-help influencers and stuff. And in many cases, it backfires and actually makes them more neurotic rather than helping them. So it's not really how CBT or Stoicism tend to approach things. I think, like, the idea that you'll attract, the other reason that CBT practitioners are not super keen on this is because in some cases we see clients who show an extreme form of this way of thinking. So clients who have obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, often have this kind of magical thinking whereby they believe that if they have a bad thought, it'll make it happen. So if I have a thought right now that you're going to get hit by a bus tomorrow, right? Then if I've got OCD, I'll be like, oh, I mustn't think that because it might make it happen somehow. Like I could kill Alex, like if I keep having that thought. And again, you get the paradox of thought suppression that I mentioned earlier. Because they're scared of it, they focus more on it and they try really hard to suppress it. That makes the thought recur more. Because they're fighting with it, it makes it more vivid over time. And, now I've got this really vivid, really recurring thought of Alex getting hit by a bus tomorrow, right? And I'm like, oh my God, like that's even more likely to make it happen. So I'm just kind of like making this worse. I'm driving myself crazy, like trying to struggle with this thought. Like, whereas most people, research shows that most people have negative thoughts like that occur automatically. And the majority of people just go, meh, and kind of shrug them off and sort of ignore them, like don't really do anything in response to them. So they don't really cause a problem. But in cognitive therapy, because people with OCD have a belief that resembles the law of attraction, and they think negative thoughts might cause negative events by magic somehow, we have to usually directly challenge that thinking. And with many clients, I've asked them to imagine that I was going to fall down the stairs and break my leg. And their first reaction is like, I can't do that. Like, I'd feel really terrible if it happens. And I'll say, well, I'll take the blame, right? Like, because I'm asking you to do it. So think really hard that, as often as you like, as vivid as you like, and we'll see whether it actually happens. Now, by chance, I've never broken a bone in my body so far in life, and I'm getting old now, so it's probably something else that's going to kill me by now, right? But many, many clients I've asked to visualize as vividly and repeatedly as they can that I was going to break my leg. Never broken my leg. Like, so maybe it's got a delayed reaction. It's all going to come and get me eventually. Like, but so that you're proving to this client through what we call a behavioral experiment. Like, but you did that thing all week long and it didn't break my leg, right? And so maybe it doesn't work the way that you think it works, right? And so maybe these other thoughts that you're having, like pushing old ladies in front of trains or whatever it is, maybe they're harmless as well. It's not actually going to happen. Maybe you could allow yourself to tolerate those thoughts and accept them, like rather than trying to suppress them or fight against them. And that's a very common conversation to have with with many clients that have OCD and clients that have similar sorts of problems. So for that reason, cognitive therapists are have that in their mind when they hear about the law of attraction. And so they think, if anything, we spend a lot of time trying to persuade people that this doesn't work, right? And then testing it out in practice so they can prove to themselves that think the mind doesn't work like that. So good luck, to people who think that, writing themselves a check for $1 million and is going to make it appear on their bank account or, other such things. It's worth a shot. Like, but that's not part of my worldview. It's not how the Stoics thought things work either. They thought if we don't think about bad events, then we're ill prepared to deal with them, and they catch us by surprise. And the mind is capable of adapting to loss and bereavement and trauma, but it has to be given the opportunity to do it. So if you picture bad things happening, you think about your own death in the right way or the loss of other people, then, you give your brain, basically just give your brain a chance to prepare itself naturally for those things happening. So you're more likely to be able to cope when these things or similar things are imminent or when they actually happen.
All right. So I was planning to end on this note, but in the last answer, I've been hit by a bus and you broke a leg. So I have to ask one more to end on a slightly more positive note. So suppose that we applied all the right strategies and we essentially became more effective at doing whatever it is that we're trying to do.
Yes.
How do we turn that into virtuous behavior and actually behave well in the world?
Well, we have to define what virtuous behavior consists in, which has taken philosophers, 2,500 years. I think I'd say is that virtuous behavior is more important to modern psychology than most people probably realize. In fact, one of the leading evidence-based treatments for clinical depression revolves around getting people to identify their core values or character strengths or virtues, and to act more consistently in accord with those. So we used to believe that when people become depressed, it's because they're not engaging frequently enough in pleasurable activities, in part. But now we understand that it's not so much pleasurable activities that depressed people miss. It's meaningful activities that they perceive as fulfilling or contributing to a praiseworthy, admirable, worthwhile life. People who are depressed cannot look in the mirror and take any kind of satisfaction or pride in what they see. They feel worthless, useless. But identifying what is worthwhile in a human being and acting more in accord with that, usually that corresponds with what we think of as kind of classical virtues like wisdom, kindness, fairness, and self-discipline, courage, endurance. Generally, the weird thing is when you question people about this, again, research has shown, like Seligman and Peterson's famous research in this area, and the studies that it's showed people generally agree quite a lot, like more than you'd think, about the character traits that are admirable. There is something I'd add to that, though, which is, apart from the fact that we agree, most people agree on the kind of general traits that we admire, there's something more important that doesn't get talked about much, but it's central to ancient philosophy. And that's the idea that the most obvious problem that we have when it comes to morality and virtue is that we're hypocrites. And the majority of us, all of us are hypocrites. Like, we say one thing and we do another, right? And we exhibit double standards. So the qualities that we admire in other people are not qualities that we exhibit in our own lives. The qualities that we criticize other people for exhibiting, we don't necessarily praise others for exhibiting the contrary or opposing qualities, right? So people spend a lot of time these days complaining about politicians that they don't like, right? But it should strike us as odd that they don't praise politicians that exhibit the opposite qualities, or that they don't attempt themselves to cultivate the opposite qualities. So we're contradicting ourselves a lot in our moral thinking. And that's what the Socratic method developed as a cure for. Socrates tried really hard to point out these contradictions to people and encourage them to resolve them so that their thoughts and actions became more consistent. And for many people today, I know that they feel lost and nihilistic and confused, and they're not sure where to look to for moral values. And Socrates' answer, I think, would be the first place you can start is identifying contradictions in because pretty much all of us agree in the law of non-contradiction. Like, there's something wrong if you say two things that contradict each other, that are incompatible. Like, if you might not be able to agree, and the best way to run a country, but we can all agree that if somebody says one thing and does another, that's not right. Like, nobody admires hypocrisy. Like, so that gives us a solid foundation in order to start working, I think, on our own character. And here's a tip: like Socrates, what he often did was ask people what qualities they admire in other people, like such as, there's a good dialogue where he asks a guy called Critobulus, what qualities would an ideal friend exhibit? And he rattles off a kind of list of, he'd lend you money if you're broke, and he'd be honest with you and tell you about your flaws, but he'd do it in a polite way. He'd come and visit you when you're sick. It's easy for him to identify all the qualities that a good friend would exhibit. And then Socrates says, well, how many of these qualities do you actually exhibit yourself? He says, well, none. And Socrates says, well, don't you think it would make more sense for you to kind of start trying to cultivate them? You seem pretty clear, in a sense, about your values. Like, you're just not applying them consistently.
Yeah. So you have a book coming up about Socrates, right? Can people pre-order it already? Yeah. What should they expect, and where should they get it?
And I have a book that just came out about Marcus Aurelius, and then unusually, I have two books in 1 year. So I have a book about Socrates that comes out in October in English in the US. but it's being translated into some other languages as well. It's an audiobook, it's an ebook, it's in hardback at the moment, and you can pre-order it on Amazon or from Macmillan, the publisher, or from all good booksellers. Anyway, the publisher like to say you can order it from anywhere that sells books.
All right, so I'll be sure to include the links to at least Amazon below. I don't promise links to any place that sells books, but I only know a few. All right, Donald, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. I've been waiting to talk to you for a long time, so I'm glad it finally happened.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure for me too.
All right, thank you.